as you gather, I've given you a sort of a brief introduction to sort of critical literacy. Indeed, as critical literacy expanded, it sort of developed its own sort of branch. I mean, its volume is focused on critical literacy today, and moved it significantly from Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the press, and very much influenced by French scholars, Bourdieu, Bakhtin, and Derrida, and others. And I'll expand upon that a little bit more as we move on to the next lecture. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the developments. You've seen me mentioned already the new literacy study and the emergence of the concept of literacy practices being very much looked at from a social perspective. There seems to be in the field a sort of a sense of wanting to look at these things in a complementary sort of fashion with sort of outside the head, inside the head model. But you sort of see the emergence of this new literacy studies, and not far behind it, the advent of multiple literacies. And in the next lecture, I'll talk more extensively about multiple literacies, because in a sense they were beginning to sort of deal with what was actually happening in the real world, particularly in the digital realm, where all of us were engaged in literacy in a very dynamic, open-ended fashion, changing as quickly as the software infrastructure enabled you to architect in your own sort of fashion, fairly dynamic, very transformative, in a way that sort of moved us beyond verbocentrism. Indeed, the multiple literacies work were very interested, particularly with the arguments of Kress, that we operate with an understanding of sound and image and how these things may interface with each other in a multi-layered fashion, and how we as participants in literacy are agents transforming these sort of things, interacting with one another socially, and ourselves in a constellation of ways. I'll expand upon that in conjunction with also talking about what happened in the world of digital literacies, where it went from using computers for statistical analyses to using computers for word processing to the creation of hypertext markup language, which was in a sense, the architectural foundation for the internet and the interfacing of animation, film, sound, and whatnot, and which sort of undergirds the repertoire of possibilities that we have now. In conjunction with the sort of the critical turn, there were some interesting highlights that I want to focus on just briefly here. One was an interest in finding and looking at literacy in terms of authenticity. What's authentic, and trying to, in our schools and in our educational realm, is how do we actually support authentic engagements in literacy, using these tools, with these literacy tools, socially and cognitively and culturally in authentic sort of ways. And one found oneself wanting to sort of examine local everyday uses and everyday possibilities as one did so. what became sort of interesting in terms of this was indeed a way of actually ensuring that we were dealing with literacy practices and respecting socio-cultural dynamics. But they also raise the issues, particularly today, of things don't just operate locally. They also operate globally. There's a global flow of interactions and ideas. And as we move forward, you can sort of see that one of the areas in need of development is how these things begin to work together. And also related to this is in schools, the view has always been that you create a sort of almost Rousseauian, authentic learning experiences and that, but you also sort of need to come back to a key aspect of education which has to do with development. And what we saw sort of happen in the social and critical turn were interesting issues about looking at the power dynamics and sometimes changing it and doing extensive ethnographies to look at communities relative to the cultural practices of literacy, authentic or as contrived as it might be in schools. In one sense, while Freire got sort of criticized for this, what we sort of saw was 1,000 lights. But what was the theory that began to describe this solar system? And what is the theory that sort of brings this together in a way that helps us sort of understand issues of cultural roots, and how the issues of the ethics and issues of borders and other aspects play out, and how this relates to not just a learner's development, but a learning systems development. And how do these things play out relative to the issues of cultural development, where culture isn't necessarily a fixed element. And what you discover as you sort of look at these issues, that one is sort of navigating in a space which is quite tricky. Linda Smith talks about that relative to when one is engaging with, for example, Indigenous communities, one needs to recognize that one is on tricky grounds if one is not part of that culture. And even if one is part of that culture, how tricky it is to navigate in that space, particularly relative to an orientation to development and the forces at play. Indeed, if you read some of the literature by some of the Chinese scholars, they will discuss at some length how global ideas, including Marxist theory, doesn't fit well in the Chinese context. And so how does one operate across borders which are becoming oftentimes more porous, or if not colonized or knocked down in this sort of digital age. And so there's development issue actually gets you into interesting considerations about not only educational development but also socio-cultural development that oftentimes require difficult conversations that around these issues, and a consideration of ways of understanding groups and individuals who might be approaching, whose world might be framed quite differently. And so it gets you involved in an interesting discussion of issues of global ethics. So anyhow, as we move forward in terms of looking more deeply at the critical turn, particularly in terms of issues of multiple literacies. In the background, some of these ideas will be issues we'll be wanting to look at as we look at some of the research in here and some of the frames that are using that might serve as possibilities for a grander theory and for guidelines for doing research across borders, which is sensitive to the cultural issues and respectful of different cultures, as we increasingly are dealing in the sort of interchange between the global and local, and the interchange between the critical and the socio-cultural. Next time. Thank you.